And we do that in a couple of ways. We do workshops, some of them free, but we also do on-site training, consulting. We do boot camps. So if you're thinking of designing an API, there's two of us here, myself and you might have heard of Rockley yesterday. We can come in and help you do that. I'm fortunate enough to have been at a few of these events, the Nordic events, and somehow I'm always talking about design or UX or things like that, so I wanted to continue the theme. It's a fun topic, right? We like talking about it. For me, all this kind of started a few years ago while playing with some mobile app development stuff, and I started learning about personas and all these UX things, and it just kind of made sense. Why aren't we doing more of this in this space? Right? It seems to fit. And it turned out a lot of people felt the same way, so we're seeing more and more interest in this idea. And it's amazing to see, even in the titles of these talks, how we're getting more of that idea incorporated into how we do this work. So design is suddenly becoming very important for us again, right? Design, just like APIs, is one of those terms that could mean so many different things, depending on who you ask. I don't want to define it, but maybe we can agree there are some aspects of design that are common, right? In the past, I've talked about design as academics have phrased it, functionality, usability, and experience. We have these three parts to it, these features. There's something called the Vitruvius principles. Vitruvius outlined how Roman architecture should be built. And he described these principles, something being solid, useful, and beautiful. So there's this long history of looking at design and understanding that there's different ways of looking at something that's created. I think that's continued. If we look at Peter Morville's user experience honeycomb, Morville describes how a UX person does their work, the things that they care about. And he has all these pieces. I think it's fair to say, if you look at how we've been designing, going back to web services, only as far back as web services, let's say, and SOAP, we've really concentrated a lot on usefulness and value, right? We became very good at exposing functions. We became very good at creating value for our business, right? And these are essential parts of the design. We shouldn't overlook them. They were a huge step forward. Where we're starting to explore now, it seems like, are things like usability. We're seeing more and more interest in this idea of going beyond just, you've given me some data internally, how do I give that to the world? And we're starting to actually look at, how is this interface used by someone? How can we improve the usability of it? And some of the people who are experimenting more are getting into these other aspects of the space. How discoverable is the API? How credible is it? How desirable is it? What are the emotions that we're evoking in someone? What is the experience, the context of using the API? I'd say for the most part, it's a lot of talk at the moment. People are recognizing that these concepts exist, maybe not a lot of depth, right? And that's where I hope we start to continue to evolve. What this talk is today is really just me regurgitating some stuff in my head. Okay, I'm going to describe to you some of the thoughts I have. I also want to show you an experiment I've been working on, a little design tool. The talk is really an excuse for me to be able to show you the tool, but let's go through the motions of slides and talking. I think design, in a lot of ways, is based on faith, right? In the past, we had a lot of faith in standards. Standards like HTTP, or before that, things like WS addressing, WSDL, SOAP. What I mean is, if I talked about web services design a few years ago, if we bought a book on web services design, it would probably be focused a lot on concepts around deployment, implementation, how to adhere to specifications, right? And the reason that makes sense is because we believe the people who wrote these things knew what they were doing, right? I trust them. If I adhere to the rules that they set out, I assume my design will be good. I have a belief that they worked very hard to create a set of codes, of rules, of standards that if I adhere to, I create good design. In some ways, it feels like we're rejecting part of this now. And we're moving towards maybe faith in experts, right? So we're saying we can go beyond these standards. We'll say that it's up to us to be more organic, more flexible, right? That's a big feature of APIs nowadays. You kind of construct a URI, you agree on what it should look like. There's no hard-coded rules. But what I find more and more with the people I work with who are designing APIs, they're looking for more and more prescriptive guidance. So they move their seeking of faith in standards to now searching for best practices. So instead of standards, we start to look at blogs or presentations or conferences like this, hoping that someone will tell us how to design an API that our users will like. What maybe is missing is having a faith in some kind of process of design. I think we definitely have processes, right? We have lots of processes for developing applications, deploying them. We're seeing whole cultural shifts with things like DevOps. But I don't know if we put our faith into design the way that, let's say, UX professionals do or design professionals do, right? They still do all those other things. There's still a lot of standards in the design world. And there's a massive amount of expertise, right? Everyone has an opinion. But they also put a lot of faith into things like this, into having some kind of process that they go through to understand what their product or what their application should look like, how the design should evolve. And there's a few different ones, right? There's not that one formal design process, but if we boil them all together, and if I took out just the key elements of what they do to make their product successful, we start to identify a few things. The first is they focus at the beginning on need finding, on some kind of research. They go out of their way to make sure they understand who they're designing for, right? Who the product will be built for. That permeates into the product itself. It lets them have that external perspective. The second thing they do is they find a way for their process to help the team come up with new things, with ideas. So they have this word ideation, the generation of ideas, which means creating a social environment, a collaborative environment, but also having steps built into the process to make it easy to come up with new things. And then the third thing they do is they make sure to test all of these ideas, because up until this point, it's all theory and hypothesis, right? So they go back and make sure that this design works. And of course, we can't forget all of this is iterative, right? We don't end at production. We keep going back and looking at the design again and again. So this is what design people do, and they've honed this over years and years, and the good ones apply some form of it. For some reason, when we look at our space, we don't necessarily do all this. And it might be because we perceive this world as different. In the API space, we build something on a machine for another machine to use. That was popular thinking. In the last few years, we've acknowledged that maybe there's a human being involved, right? There's a developer somewhere who builds that client. And I say we deserve a pat on the back for acknowledging this, and we've gotten into this whole world of building tooling to support that interaction, right? Our company makes some of this. Documentation portals, right? Usage analysis, all of these things that the human can use to understand the API. So that's good. We're starting to evolve there. I think it's important that we don't forget this isn't the only way we support interactions. The developer creates the client with a development platform. This actually gives us another place to interact, right? The way your API looks, the design decisions you make actually impact the experience as well. It's not just about the documentation. It's not just about those supporting things. The runtime interface itself has an impact on the design work for the developer on the client side. So if we take those three ideas from before and apply them to the current space, we find that there are things we can use, right? For example, in the need finding space, there's a lot you can do. And I've done some of this with clients this year. We can do things like empathy interviews. You can start talking to prospective users of your APIs. You can employ things like participatory design where they actually have a seat at the table. Inviting the developer, if it's an internal API, from the development team into the room when you design can have a massive impact. Deciding to really actively use things like personas to capture the perspective of the user of your API can have great benefits. So we have these things we can actually airlift out of the UX space and drop in. On the testing side, there's so much we can do as well. Writing client code, as Joshua Block described, is hugely beneficial and probably the cheapest thing you can do. But you can also watch someone while they use your API and collect data about how people use it. But I want to focus on the second part, this idea of ideation. What could we take from the world of design to help us in ideation of API designs? How do we get better at creating API designs? One thing that they do in that space is they sketch. Here's a Frank Gehry sketch. Gehry is an architect, US architect, who's designed some amazing buildings. And one of the things he's famous for are these sketches. It's a huge part of his process. Before he gets to the point of blueprints and really getting into elaborate design, he starts with simple sketches to try things out. It turns out this is a massively important part of design and has been for years and years and years. Bill Buxton wrote a book about this a few years back called Sketching User Experiences. So he didn't invent this, but he started to articulate it. And what's telling is when he starts pulling out the qualities of what makes a good sketch. Look at some of these things. We want sketches that are quick, timely, inexpensive, and disposable. It means that we need a way to design APIs at the beginning where we're not afraid to walk away from what we've done, where we reduce the emotional investment, that we start working together as a team to design something, we're not scared to just throw it away and start over. That can be a challenge for us today. The real goal here is to end up with many, many sketches. Think about how you get good at something. It's not by trying it once. I haven't met a team yet who can sit down and just design an API. And yet I've met many teams who try and do just that. Right? They sit down, start plotting out the API, but they don't go back and start over from scratch 10 times to really see if they're getting to the best place. The kind of process I like to do now for design looks something like this. I start with a sketch. So this would be an initial like 10 or 15 iterations of the API with very little user participation, right? We do this based on what we know about users, but I don't go out and test it with anyone. This is an internal exercise. I might follow that with a low-fidelity prototype. So with this thing, I actually go out and see what people think of it. I put a few more details in, and maybe I do a few less iterations of this, maybe only 3 or 4. I might follow that with a high-fidelity prototype. So think about a pilot, right? I'm going to launch this to a closed group of people, but it's going to look like production, right? I'm still going to get more participation, but now fewer iterations. And then finally, of course, we get to implementation. And the process doesn't stop, right? We should still be going back and doing this work. But by the end, I want the fewest iterations. This is important because it captures one of our big constraints, that when you publish your interface, how do you change it? Right? You need to change it in a way that doesn't break. It means you need to do your learning early on. You can't do your learning here. You have to do your iterations up there. We do some form of sketching today, right? It's not that we don't do this. In my experience, we usually do it in 4 ways, either on paper, whiteboard, maybe you code something up really quickly, or you use some tooling. These are effective ways of sketching, but what I found is when it comes to things like whiteboarding, which is really, really valuable and effective, I don't meet a lot of teams who are willing to just erase and start over. You start going down a road with your whiteboard design, and often you become married to it. Also, it can be difficult to get the right level of detail for an API on a whiteboard, right? Drawing out particular bits of data. The problem with doing something like coding is you lose that abstraction that you need for design, right? You start thinking more about the problems of solving coding problems and less about how to do this interface, how to make it something that people would like to use. So I want to show you something I've been experimenting with, a sketching tool for APIs called Rapido. And I call it an experiment because it's full of bugs, right? So that way, it's acceptable. So I'm going to have to look at the big screen while I do this, so it's going to be weird. So you may not be able to see me, but you can look at the screen. So here's Rapido, or Rapido. So let's sign in. And all this is a way to quickly create APIs. So I'll create a project. Let's imagine we're creating an API for this conference, right? The Nordic API event. I can choose my project type, give it some description, and we can go in. So the first thing I suggest is that you create a vocabulary when you're designing an API. This helps you start to define the words that you think your users might use, right? In a lot of ways, that's what our APIs are, a collection of words, right, exposed as interfaces. So I might sit down and say, well, we'll have sessions, speakers, maybe the word conference, API, Nordic, etc. It seems trivial, but it's actually a powerful way to start because we're not beginning by thinking about URLs or relationships or any of these things. We're simply trying to look at our domain from the perspective of our user, and that's the key, right? You want words that are significant for your users, not words that are significant for your business or for your data, but significant for the developers who have to create applications. The other thing that I'm working on building in here is the ability to take external vocabularies. We have all these things defined like schema, right? Where we have industry words already created. You should be able to grab those and pull them in. So I support Mike Amundsen's standard called ALPS, so you can just go and grab a dictionary. It looks like that underneath, and start using that in your API. Okay, so that's nice. It's a collection of words. How is that useful? It becomes valuable when we start going into actually sketch. So I'm going to show you an example of sketching a CRUD-based API or URI style or REST for some of you. Start by looking at the root, and maybe we'll create a sessions resource. So what's nice is as I start typing it, it becomes easy to add it, and maybe we'll give it a get. And you can see how low the fidelity is here, right? I'm intentionally trying to take you away from the experience of coding. This is not meant to be an easy type it in, familiar to developers. It's meant to be a little bit more visual, something that you can share and something that you can see. You could add a child here, right? So we could call this ID. And we end up with that tree, right? So going on, you can see how this works. Now the idea is I'm creating something at a high enough level of detail that I can start to take what's in my head and put it on paper, but not so low detail or not so much of an investment that I'm not scared to just delete this and start over, right? That's the idea. It's disposable. I can create a collection of these. Now, if you start to look at this resource, there's not enough information here for us to properly sketch. So what I might do is actually go into the resource itself, and I could begin to plot out the details, right? And again, I get access to the vocabulary we created earlier, and I can quickly start to plot out what this looks like, change methods, do that kind of thing, locate other resources, etc. So this is the basis of the experiment. Could we get better at design by doing things like this to start with, where we rapidly create iterations of sketches? I also wanted to incorporate some other UX pieces here. So I put in something called a design map or scenario map. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that. When Pruitt started talking about personas, he described something called a scenario map. And all this is a way for us to say, let's say we have Ronnie's Android app, which will help us navigate the conference. I can start to talk about the steps that developer would need to take to use the API. So request list of sessions, search through list for my session. The idea here is it gives you a chance to walk through what you've created as a sketch and start to identify maybe things that don't make sense. Should we provide a filter? This is meant to be fairly social, right? You do this as a team or you do it remotely as a team, so you can go back and adjust the sketch based on some of these findings. And then lastly, of course, if you want to get to the next level of fidelity, if you want to build that prototype, you'd probably pull this out. So you could pull it out as a waddle, right, based on your favorite sketch, and then drop that into, let's say, something like our API proxy and start fiddling with it. Or if you're a fan of Apiary, like I am, you could export it as Blueprint, right, and use that tool. So that's the experiment. And let me just get back in here. But I want to leave you with three keys. 3 things you could take away. First, go beyond just being useful. Go beyond just providing functionality. Start to explore things like the usability of your interface. Fundamentally designed for people, not for the stereotype or the archetype of the developer. Find out who the actual people are who will use your interface. And remember that this idea of good design is affordable, right? We're usually on low budget for design and APIs. We're not all creating APIs as revenue sources and as our sole product. A lot of us are making APIs to supplement something. But some of the stuff I've shown you is easy to do and cheap. So you can do it. There's no excuse. If you're interested in that little snippet of an experiment I showed you, and you want to see it as it develops, I created a Twitter account for it yesterday. If I get like 5 followers, I'll start publishing this stuff out, all right, on that. I'll know that people actually care. If I get no followers, I'll keep it to myself and keep playing with it. All right, that's it for me. Thank you.